oratory or anything, that last beat, that last note is what sticks in people's minds. And that's why you can read a perfectly great novel, and it doesn't land the ending, and you're like, well, 1 star on Goodreads.
I'm giving you another example of the tension between the soluble and the insoluble, which is again about mystery. Joe Walton's Small Change series, the alternate universe, where you can solve the mysteries, you can't solve the world.
Right.
You know, they're stuck in this really dystopian, you know.
The novel with really much the way of, I mean, it's just a different history, but it's technology-wise, it's just an old-fashioned 40-year history.
No, technology-wise, but in terms of, you know, fascism winning.
Yeah, no, that's
really creepy. It's really dark. It's really noir, and that is the bit that's not solvable. So you're doing crimes that can be solved in the context of a greater crime.
Yeah, or you know, back to the
against humanity.
The last Lipkin series, you know, it's countdown to a comet hitting the Earth.
Yeah.
You know,
you can't stop that.
Yeah,
again, that's the tension between the soluble and the insoluble, which I really like.
Yeah,
great.
I try to go out cross-genre mixing when I can, but I find that this particular panel is like one of the most difficult things because the conventions of SF and the conventions of history sort of collide mostly at the beginning, which is the SF needs a lot of world building and the mystery demands that you're defined needs.
I mean, not necessarily for the crime side, but I would also say I've read some amazing sci-fi that doesn't do a lot of explicit world building. When I teach creative writing, I like to use James Patrick Kelly's Think Like a Dinosaur as a great example of a story where there's this incredibly complex thing, world, but there's no explaining. He just jumps into the story, and it works well because he's able to drop it a bit as he goes. Because one of the things less experienced writers want to do is explain the entire world up front. Because we love our worlds that we create and we're fascinated by them. And let me tell you all these awesome details I came up with. But very often that doesn't actually work. And you don't have to have the murder happen in the first chapter or whatever. But it is a convention.
Gowdy Knight does a lot of world building. She wants to tell you what women's college in a male university is like.
That book would not be published today, probably.
Yeah, because she did, because it was something that then needed telling.
Right.
Well, I also think that to a large extent, mystery and espionage and crime fiction also does its own very particular type of world building as well. I mean, you look at the likes of a John le Carré novel, for example, he was actually utilizing a science fictional technique, the use of new words like lamplighter and mole to create this milieu of this espionage world that his readers were completely unfamiliar with. Ian Fleming would do the same thing, actually using hard SF techniques, talking about the different gadgets, the watches, the cars, plus setting. You look at Tony Hillerman's Navajo Tribal Police series, for example. That's a world that is going to be entirely alien to most readers because they're just not familiar with the world of reservations and then the tribal police and things like that.
And it's a huge part of the appeal of
yes,
books. Yeah,
exactly.
Mysteries very much do inform the world that they take place in. When you mix science fiction with mystery, usually the investigation will fill in those world building details. And usually the solution also has to do with the world itself as well.
Well, coming back to the noir side of things, people have been kind of skirting the question of certain of the noir tropes, I mean, which either you're stuck with or you're subverting them. I mean, yes, the benign ones, like the first person narrator, protagonist, who goes down these mean streets, whatever, but the world itself is often intensely misogynistic, fatales, the necessity for women to be killed everywhere as a driver of the plot of one of the refrigerators trope. And it's interesting to me, as somebody who's read both the old and the new, to see how the new books try to sidestep some of that heritage. Not to mention, as Joe Walton did, getting at the intense anti-Semitism and racism that applies a lot as well.
well, it applies some effort as a writer to not rely on the tropes that you sort of absorb from either society or from the works that you've read, and try not to emulate that misogyny.
How about putting a misogynistic, anti-Semitic, slightly anti-gay kind of guy like Gender, of course, living in a world where all the rules are different to us, that's all.
I would read that.
Oh, yeah.
Joe Kaufmann addressed that in Forever War, with the time delays where the main character ends up hit in Earth like hundreds of years later, dealing with a completely different society and how complicated that was in really interesting ways.
Pushing all the way into that.
I think it was Patrick Nielsen Hayden who said that mysteries and thrillers are inherently conservative. I take it that he meant that not in our political sense, but in the sense that there's a balance that has been disturbed, and the task of the protagonist often is to restore the balance. Is that inimical to the basic goal of science fiction?
I think there is very much a sense of wanting to set right the status quo at the end of a mystery or thriller. But whether or not
Coming back to that, yeah.
I would not necessarily call that conservative.
I would also say that it's actually interesting that if we look, for example, at the noir tradition, so much of noir's thematic elements are about the insoluble, as you put it, the inability to return to that status quo, to apply that conservative aspect to it. And I think that there's sort of both of those tensions in speculative fiction as well as also in mystery. So while mystery plays with that kind of idea of conservatism and returning to status quo, I don't necessarily think that it is categorical for the genre. I don't think that it's a defining feature that it has to be brought back to the status quo. That was one of noir's primary innovations, I would actually say, in mystery as a genre when it was initially created.
Part of what also I'm doing as a private investigator, and what I think a lot of PI fiction does, is try to redress the wrongs of the system. And so I would call that's not supporting the status quo, that's fighting the status quo. And it's an extremely important role, and I think it will be more important in the future. And it's more important in dystopias where the system is inherently bad, flawed, or gone, or whatever, So that in order to get justice, you have to find it yourself.
This brings to mind, there's an excellent mystery written by Zoe Ferraris called Kingdom of Strangers that is set in Saudi Arabia, featuring a woman forensic scientist in Saudi Arabia who's investigating a serial killer. And so she's fighting against the constraints of her society, that insoluble element, while simultaneously trying to work to solve this heinous series of crimes that have been happening. And that sort of plays a lot with those issues of addressing the societal wrongs as such, or to address the injustices inherent in the system.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes in some mysteries you get the investigator trying to reclaim an island of sanity from a drowning world. Everything is drenched in corruption, and if you can make justice, find justice for this one person who's done something against the status quo. So
to fight whatever's wrong.
Makes me think of No Country for Old Men.
I think it's always a good rule of thumb to have your protagonist, if not the whole world, changed by the end of your story, regardless of whether it's a mystery or not. And if at the end of this investigation or mystery or what have you, your detective character, who doesn't have to be a detective, by the way, I just call it the detective character. If that protagonist is changed by it, because they are your view, your window into the world they live in, the world itself does feel changed by it as well.
But some people like that Peter Wimsey changes, during the course of the series, and some people want, say, Poirot also always to be Poirot, just his archetype. So it's another tension.
Yeah, well, I think that goes to the whole, I don't, like when you talk about the genre, whether the genre as a whole is conservative, other than the mystery itself being solved, I think there are very few Poirot-esque creations these days.
Well, it is a very 20s, 30s thing.
I think readers are more
That she,
sophisticated.
you know, she dragged out into the 70s.
Right, and at least, yeah, she did kill one.
The cozy, though, I think is based around, there may be some basic change, some, you know, simple changes, people grow old or whatever, but the sameness is part of the appeal.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah.
And change doesn't necessarily mean it's not like, you know, it's getting used to twisting. You know, Tommy and Tuppence, for example, you know, there's change, but it's still you could argue that's a sort of conservative, you know, good, there's a flow in a way that, you know, wouldn't be the case with, like, you know, someone whose life is like, constantly disrupted, or, you know, this, yes, this is a revelation that completely, you know, shatters what it really is.
Yeah, well, it's different tastes or different, you know, actually some people can have different tastes at different times, but they're just a different flavor of mystery.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah.
That's good one.
You mentioned one of the granddaddy crossovers, polished back. How well do you think some of the other major older crossovers, such as Cage and Steel, or especially Too Many Magicians, which are a lot of elements on their construction accessories, how well do those stand up today?
It's been a long time since I read Cage and Steel. I'm trying to remember what that's like. I unfortunately would have to reread it to give a cogent answer to that. I remember reading it and enjoying it, but I don't necessarily know whether I was doing that with sort of my critical reading brain on at the time. So I'd have to reread it.
I read a book also that's so personal.
Oh, yeah. And especially if the first time you read the book. In my case, I read Cage and Steel much in like 11, so I don't know how that will hold up. But I do think, you know, there's hold up in sort of the, you know, did the book age well or not? One thing, but certainly some of the concepts and what the mysteries do move forward. One thing I look at that is it's becoming a TV series, I think, this coming fall, and it's obviously there's still some interest in Minority Report, which, again, looking in terms of, like that, so looking into ESP and crime solving, and recognize that there's still something there. Now, granted, you're never going to see a full epic work adapted in a true way in any other medium, but clearly there's still some gems of ideas in a lot of or at least in some of the works. But in the case of Asimov with Magicians, I have very little to really say. We have, I think, about 4 minutes left, so before we change this, if there are any more questions, I should do from the panel. Any sort of great talks about anything we talked about, something we hadn't had a chance to talk about yet, or books that you want to recommend?
I mean, just following up on your last point about sort of how books hold up and whatnot. I think that whether or not a mystery written a while ago or a speculative fiction book with mystery elements holds up today is a function of something that actually has nothing to do with whether it's a mystery or whether it's speculative fiction, but it has to do with basically what engages the reader in the story. Are the characters engaging? Do the characters engage the reader as such? Because if the characters are engaging, if the plot has good momentum, if the story is accessible to a reader in the contemporary world, then by definition, it's going to hold up. Because the reader is going to look past any other sort of flaws in it because they're too caught up in the story to notice. You know, if you can count the rivets on the train's not moving fast enough.
I like a mystery that you can read more than once. I don't like something that, oh, that's how it ends. Bye.
Over-reliance on like the trick ending or whatever.
I want something, okay, it's byways of the world or byways of the character, but for me, if you can't reread it, it's not a good mystery. Or a good book.
I was watching Moonlight, the TV series Moonlight recently, and I was shocked at how bad some of the first episodes were. There were these incredibly familiar mysteries, sort of over-relying on the hot vampire character to distract you from the fact that they were extremely predictable, familiar, mystery plots, and that was a really interesting thing for me to think about. That if you don't know the mystery genre, you'll have people like, I want to write mysteries, but I'm not going to read any of them. So when we write this thing, and they'll write something like, yeah, we've seen that story 25,000 times, and that becomes a
element. And in science fiction, again, we're talking about conversations between books. It's a community. And if you're going to write mysteries or science fiction or fantasy, you have to immerse yourself in what's been done.
Right. Great.
And things that are in conversation with what has been done before are often very satisfying things.
Oh yeah, no. Take Peter Lindsay, stand him on his head. Make Harriet Vane. The real detective he wants.
Jeans and Worcester and wrote them in the steampunk world. Where There's a lot of stuff going on. I can't remember all we did, but it wasn't brilliant, but it was enough of a hook that, this whole thing that was really working. And you knew where you were going with that stuff.
Oh yeah.
We have hit our time. I'd like to thank everyone's friends. There's a lot to talk about.
Prime Minister.